Thank you for joining again. My name is Emily. I'm with Tutoring with a Twist, and I've been reading The Marrow Thieves. So this is our second week. This is our second chapter. So if you didn't tune into the first chapter, make sure you get a chance to check that out. Today I'm going to be reading from page 18, The Fire. It's a pretty short chapter, and I'll give some questions to go along with it to kind of get us thinking about some of the themes, and especially some of the characters that we're starting to see emerging in the story. So you can follow along. You can save this video for later if you want to use it to help you kind of study the book, and I hope you will check it out. Okay, so we'll get started. So page 18, The Fire. Mig explained it one night at the fire. Dreams get caught in the webs woven in your bones. That's where they live, in that marrow there. He poked at the crackling wood with a pointy stick till the shadows were frenetic against his tan face, till they slid into the longer shoots of hair near the front of his mohawk, the tendrils he swept up and patted into place atop the shorter brush with the care of a pageant queen. He didn't make eye contact with us, the motley group seated in a loose semicircle around the fire, beneath the trees where he commanded place. I imagined spiderwebs in my bones and turned my palm towards the moon, watching the ballet of bones between my elbow and wrist twist to make it so. I saw webs clotted with dreams like fat flies. I wondered if the horses I'd ridden into this dawn were still caught in there like bugs, whinnying at the shift. Mig nudged the round stones placed around the perimeter of the fire with his boot. You could see where the holes in his sole had been patched up with sap and scavenged leather. How did they get in there? RiRi, now 7, was always curious and not shy with her questions. You were born with them. Your DNA weaves them into the marrow like spinners, Mig answered. The flames tried to settle, and he prodded them to dance again. He added, that's where they pluck them from. I pulled each of my fingers into the palm and made a fist, silhouetted against the fire, flames licking around the tight ball of brown and bone. I imagined my brother tied to a chair at the school, a flock of gray-hooded villains tightening his beaded chains while they recited Hail Marys like synchronized swimmers. Mig sat satisfied that we were all at attention, that we were listening with every cell. He leaned against a felled tree beside Minerva, who woke up with his rustling. He rolled a smoke out of his precious tobacco stores and plucked a twig out of the fire with a burning ember at the tip to light it with. Old Minerva, nearsighted to squinting, lifted her nose at the smell. Her lips fell slack, and she sighed. Those first few exhales were big and wasteful as Mig tried to get the damp paper to light, and smoke billowed across the clearing like messages. Everything was always damp, so we were trained to sniff out mold to keep that sickness at bay. Minerva made her hands into shallow cups and pulled the air over her head and face, making prayers out of ashes and smoke. Real old-timey, that Minerva. Mig and Minerva were the only grown-ups in our group. Mig wore his hair shaved to the skull, except down the middle, and had a mustache that only grew on the left side of his top lip. He was tall but bent like a walking question mark, and he was short with words and patience. Mig wore army pants, alternating between 2 identical pairs, and layers of brown and green sweaters. He kept a small pouch hung on a shoelace around his neck and tucked into those sweaters. Once, when I'd asked him, he told me that was where he kept his heart, because it was too dangerous to keep it in his chest, what with the sharp edges of bones so easily broken. I never asked again. Too many metaphors and stories wrapped into stories. It could be exhausting talking to Mig. Minerva was dark, round, and tiny like a tree stump. She kept her long gray hair in 2 braids like a little girl, with a flowered kerchief tied over her head and under her round chin. She had old-timey ways, but you couldn't get much from her either. She didn't talk, and when she did, it was in bursts, accompanied by laughter and maybe a scream or two. Mostly she watched. Everything. Us kids playing in the river, the way the trees tilted to the north towards what was left of the natural landscape, beyond the clear cut stripped of topsoil. She watched the birds on their perpetual migration to anywhere, the fire at end of day, and the way we clapped each other's backs when trading off on the trap lines. There were 7 of us in the group, 5 boys and 2 girls, not including the elders. Not one of us were related by blood, which was a good thing for those closer in age, since in the old days, when our families were huge and sprawling, accidentally dating a second or third cousin had meant you had to ask about genealogy right off the bat. But it was also lonely not having the common connection of grandparents or aunties like we used to have so often. There was Chi-boy, who at 17 was the oldest boy and taller than anyone else. He was quiet, almost to the point of being mute, and as skinny as a doe. He never seemed to sleep as long as the rest of us, or need as much food, and he stuck close to Mig, so that when he was needed, he was no more than 1 syllable away. He came from the west, from the Cree lands. After Chi-boy, there was me, 16. I was nicknamed Frenchie, as much for my name as for my people, the Métis. I came from a long line of hunters, trappers, and voyageurs. But now, with most of the rivers cut into pieces and lakes left as gray sludge puckers on the landscape, my own history seemed like a myth along the lines of dragons. Compared to Chi-boy's 6+ feet, I wasn't the tallest, but I did have the longest hair of any of the boys, almost to my waist. Burnt ombre at the untrimmed edges. I braided it myself each morning to keep it out of the way and to remind myself of things I couldn't quite remember, but that nevertheless I knew to be true. My clothes were also burnt from the sun and wear, a mottled brown from their original tones of black. Then there were the 12-year-old twins, Tree and Zheegwon, whose matched green eyes communicated without words between them. They were broader than the rest of us, with wide shoulders and heavy hands that hung from ropey arms. They were dotted with scars I couldn't bring myself to ask about. They shared 1 baseball cap between the 2 of them, changing it from head to head one day to the next. Slopper was next, the 9-year-old with the belly of a 50-year-old diabetic. His family came from the East Coast. The girls had Wab, who at 18 was practically a woman. She had a vicious keloid slash that split her face nearly in 2. Then there was RiRi, who came from a Métis community close to where my father had said ours used to be, who was old enough to piss in the bush and swear when we played red ass on an abandoned brick walls, but who was still a child. Us kids, we longed for the old-timey. We wore our hair in braids to show it. We made sweat lodges out of broken branches, dug back into the earth, covered over with our shirts tied together at the buttonholes. Those lodges weren't very hot, but we sat in them for hours and willed the sweat to pop over our willowy arms and hairless cheeks. It's time for story. Mig exhaled smoke as he spoke. I watched the word story puff over the fire and spread into a cumulative haze that smelled of ground roots and acrid burn just above our dark heads. Slopper struggled to his feet and started over to his tent. The youngest weren't privy to story, not yet anyway. RiRi made the face she pulled out when she wanted something, like an extra piece of camp bread, or to sleep in my tent so I could tell her stories to keep the nightmares away. Meg just looked at her, lifting one eyebrow higher than the other. "Aw, Meg, can't I stay for a little bit?" She received no answer, and kicked rocks all the way to her tent. The woods grew quiet now. Even the beetles stopped rubbing their smooth shells on softened bark. Even the wind picked around the branches instead of rattling straight through. Meg leaned in so that the fire illuminated his face from the bottom like unsteady stage lights, and he opened a hand, palm down, to indicate the ground, this ground, as he began story. Okay, so that's the end of the 2nd chapter. And then rest of the book kind of jumps into the story that they're talking about. So I'm going to leave it there for today, but I did want to say, do pay attention to some of the questions. It kind of gets you fleshing out the characters and thinking about who is kind of coming into the story. And another thing I wanted to point out is if you're looking for other books, or if you're looking for this book in particular, if you're looking for other books by Indigenous authors, there's a really great store that I've relied on for a lot of my classroom sets and bringing Indigenous authors into the class, and they're called Strong Nations. So you can order books online from them from www.strongnations.com, and it's a local Nanaimo-owned business, and they're really great for helping you find Indigenous authors and things to kind of get you thinking at different perspectives. Okay, so thank you so much again for joining me, and I look forward to continuing the story. And if you were listening in and you really like this book, I would love to hear other Indigenous authors or books that you've read that you would recommend that can connect to this one. So you can put those in the comments in the video below. So thank you so much again for joining me, and I look forward to continuing the story.